Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for your first storyteller of the second half of the show? Let's hear it for Ted, everybody.
What's new in your corner of the world? In 2013 and 2014, every time I visited my 92-year-old father, that was the first thing he'd say to me. What's new in your corner of the world? He was 5 years into Alzheimer's by that point, and my mother was grappling with her incipient dementia. And he said this for a number of reasons. The first one was that he was genuinely interested. He was always interested in what I had been up to, what my wife and children were doing, all the interesting things that he wanted to hear that we were doing with our lives. But there was more than that. What's new in your corner of the world was a bit of a dodge for him. It was a way of asking what was happening without knowing what was happening. It was a way of saying, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm going to show concern for you. And I always loved it. It was very comforting, even as it was upsetting, because I knew that it was a conversation that would be pleasant and happy and loving, but ultimately go nowhere, because I'd answer and I'd talk about my family and I'd talk about my career and I'd talk about the things that we were doing. And after about 3 minutes, my father would look up and he'd smile at me and he'd say, so what's new in your corner of the world? I learned, as many families of dementia patients do, that this is called looping. It's also called, as someone at the assisted living facility where he and my mother were living, and I love this term even as it makes me melancholy, it's called the eternal present. It's a place where you're stuck. It's a place that you can never really escape sometimes when you have dementia. 10 years go by. My parents are long gone, both from dementia. Their brains literally drained out of the back of their head. They were university professors and knowledge was very dear to them, and I watched them disappear. And 10 years later, I am in therapy, and my therapist says to me, we're going to spend some time in the present moment. This is what we're going to do. This is what mindfulness is all about. In the past, you are depressed. In the future, you have anxiety about it. But in the present, he says, you are perfect. And I think about this, and he wants me to visualize a present that is, there's nothing else but right now. And as I do this, I realize I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for 30 years, and I've covered some pretty horrific things from the beginnings of my career with police reporting days to being at Columbine High School hours after it happened to post 9/11 stuff in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq and places that were intimidating, shall we say. A lot of that stuff. And one of the things I've realized is that this eternal present is not good for a journalist. There's no perfect moment when you're a journalist. The present is the time where things come at you, where cataclysms come your way with the ring of a phone or with the sound of an explosion in the distance. And the present is not something to be considered perfect for me. It never has been. And I realized that. It's kind of an epiphany. I realized that during this therapy, is that for a journalist, that is, the present is something that can be menacing and that can trap you in a very different way than my father and ultimately my mother were trapped in the eternal present, looping and looping and looping. So that context I have now, as over the past few months, I've been frankly stuck and struggling and trying to figure out a lot of different things about myself and trying to push forward and not being very successful. And these days I wake up before dawn without the alarm, not needed. I've moved back with my family for a number of years now to the house where I grew up. So I wake up in the morning in the room where I was conceived, which is another story for another night that we're not going to get into right now. Talk about therapy. And I wake up, and for many, many days, I felt stuck in this loop, this episodic thing where I can't push my life forward. And a few days ago, I started thinking about my father and what he would say. What's new in your corner of the world? He meant that as a question when he was saying it. But now, a decade after his death, I hear him in my head, and I hear the kindness in his voice, and I hear the solicitousness, which is a word that he loved, as he asked that. But I no longer think of it as a question. I've started in the past few days to think about it as a challenge. What's new in your corner of the world means not only what's new, but what can you make new? And so I've been starting to wake up each morning and say to myself, hearing his voice in my head, what's new in your corner of the world? And I am determined to make something small new that day. I'm determined to be unstuck. I'm determined to be out of the loop, and not in the way that we usually talk about being out of the loop. And each morning I hear the words of a dead man pushing me on, saying, don't be stuck.